The winter air was sharp and biting as a group of 5 friends, Sarah, Emily, Jessica, Rachel, and Mia, set off on their long-anticipated camping trip in the remote forests of Vancouver, British Columbia. The dense woodlands, draped in a blanket of snow, seemed to beckon them into a world untouched by time, a sanctuary far removed from the stresses of their everyday lives. They had been planning this trip for months, eager to escape into nature's embrace, to lose themselves in the silence of the wilderness and the camaraderie of their friendship. As they drove deeper into the forest, the towering evergreens formed a wall of ancient sentinels, their branches heavy with snow, casting long shadows on the narrow, winding road. The cabin they had rented was nestled at the edge of a frozen lake, its wooden beams aged but sturdy, offering a rustic charm that made them feel instantly at home. Inside, a stone fireplace dominated the room, its hearth cold but inviting, waiting to be filled with the crackling warmth of a fire. For the first 2 days, the forest was a paradise of winter beauty. The air was crisp, the sky a pale blue that seemed to stretch on forever. They spent their days exploring the surrounding woods, where the silence was so profound it was almost a sound in itself, broken only by the crunch of snow beneath their boots or the occasional rustle of an unseen creature. The girls took endless photos capturing the serene landscape, the frost-covered trees, and the wildlife that seemed almost mythical in its presence. Bears lumbered in the distance, their thick fur blending into the shadowed underbrush. Rabbits darted across the snow, their white coats making them nearly invisible against the ground, and once, just before dusk, they glimpsed a lone gazelle, its delicate form poised and elegant, as if it were the very spirit of the forest itself. Evenings were spent in the cozy warmth of the cabin, where they played cards by the firelight, their laughter filling the small space as they shared stories and inside jokes. They cooked hearty meals on the old iron stove, the aroma of stew and bread mingling with the scent of pine that seeped in through the logs. The days were perfect, a peaceful retreat that felt like a world all their own. On the 3rd day, exhilarated by their success in exploring the surrounding area, the girls decided to take their adventure to the next level. They had heard about the Capilano River, famous for its scenic beauty and winding waters that cut through the dense forest. The idea of kayaking down the river, surrounded by the pristine winter landscape, was too tempting to resist. They packed their gear, dressed in layers to ward off the cold, and set out with a sense of excitement thrumming in their veins. In their eagerness, they neglected to check the weather forecast, a simple but fatal mistake. The skies, still clear when they set out, began to change as they reached the river. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, creeping in like a slow-moving beast. The river, which had seemed so calm and inviting, began to churn with an undercurrent that spoke of danger, but the girls, laughing and chatting, paid it no heed. As they launched their kayaks into the water, the first icy drops of rain began to fall. What started as a light drizzle quickly escalated into a downpour, the kind that soaks through layers of clothing and chills to the bone. The wind picked up, gusting through the trees with a low, mournful howl, and the river swelled, its once gentle waves now turning into foaming crests that threatened to tip the kayaks. Panic set in as the storm intensified. The river roared around them, its icy waters battering their kayaks with a force they could not hope to resist. The wind tore at them, howling like a beast, driving the rain into their faces and blinding them to the dangers ahead. Sharp rocks lurked beneath the turbulent surface, hidden from view but waiting to strike. One by one, the girls were thrown from their kayaks, their bodies slammed against the jagged stones, bruised and battered by the relentless assault. Sarah was the first to be separated from the group. A particularly vicious wave capsized her kayak, and she was swept away, the current dragging her downstream with terrifying speed. She fought to keep her head above water, gasping for breath as the icy river pulled her under again and again. The last thing she heard before the roaring in her ears drowned out all else was the sound of her friends screaming for help, their voices lost to the storm. When she finally washed up on a snow-covered bank, she lay there for what felt like hours, her body too numb and battered to move. The storm had passed, leaving an eerie silence in its wake, but the damage had been done. Sarah struggled to her feet, her limbs heavy and uncooperative, and looked around. The river was a distant, roaring line in the landscape, and the forest loomed around her, vast and indifferent. She was alone. Miles away, Emily fought her way through the dense underbrush, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her clothes were soaked through, and the cold gnawed at her like a living thing, sapping her strength with every step. The forest was a maze of shadows, the trees towering above her like ancient giants, their branches creaking ominously in the wind. She called out for her friends, but only the silence of the wilderness answered, a silence so profound it pressed in on her, making her feel as though she were the only living thing for miles around. Jessica, dazed and disoriented, had been swept far from the river. She stumbled through the snow, her vision blurred by tears and exhaustion. Every direction looked the same, an endless sea of white, broken only by the dark shapes of the trees. Her mind was a whirl of panic and fear, the realization that she was truly lost hitting her with a force almost as physical as the rocks that had battered her in the river. Rachel, her leg throbbing with pain from where it had struck a submerged rock, limped through the snow, each step a small agony. The cold was relentless, sapping her strength, and the pain in her leg made every movement excruciating. But she pressed on, driven by the desperate hope that she would somehow find her friends. The thought of them, lost and suffering as she was unbearable. Mia, the strongest swimmer among them, had managed to pull herself onto a small island in the middle of the river. But now, as she sat huddled against the base of a tree, her body trembling with cold, she realized the gravity of her situation. The island was tiny, a mere speck of land surrounded by the icy, swirling waters, and there was no way off. The forest that surrounded the river was dark and forbidding, and she had no idea where she was or how far she had been swept. As night fell, the temperature plummeted, and the wilderness seemed to close in around them. The forest, which had been so beautiful in the daylight, took on a sinister aspect in the dark. The trees seemed to move and shift, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out to ensnare them. The wind howled through the treetops, carrying with it strange, almost human-like cries that sent shivers down their spines. And then there were the wolves, their howls echoing through the night, a chilling reminder that they were not alone in the wilderness. The cold was merciless, seeping into their bones and draining their strength. With no food, no shelter, and no idea of where they were, the girl's situation grew increasingly desperate. Sarah, her body aching from the cold and exhaustion, tried to remember the survival tips she had read in a book once. She knew she needed to find shelter and food, but the forest offered little in the way of either. Her hands, numb and trembling, were useless at starting a fire, and she could barely hold onto the small knife she had managed to keep with her. Emily, after what felt like hours of wandering, stumbled upon a small clearing. There, she managed to start a small fire with the last of the matches in her pocket, but it was weak, the flames flickering and dying against the relentless cold. She huddled close to it, hoping it would keep the wolves at bay, but the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow behind her made her blood run cold. Heart pounding, she turned, expecting to see a wolf or some other predator, but there was nothing, just the dark, silent forest staring back at her. Jessica, nearly delirious with cold and exhaustion, found what looked like an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. Relief flooded her as she pushed open the door, the hinges creaking in protest. But as she stepped inside, the air was thick with the scent of rot and decay. Strange symbols were scrawled on the walls in what looked like dried blood, and the floor was littered with bones too small to be anything other than human. She backed out slowly, the sense of wrongness so overwhelming it made her stomach turn. Better to face the cold and the wild than whatever haunted that place. Rachel, unable to go any further, collapsed against a tree. Her injured leg was throbbing painfully, and every breath sent a stab of pain through her chest. She had tried to keep moving, knowing that stopping could mean death, but her body had reached its limit. As she sat there, struggling to stay conscious, she heard something moving through the snow, slow, deliberate footsteps. Her heart raced, and she tried to get up, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. The footsteps came closer and closer, until she could see a shadowy figure emerging from the trees. It was too dark to make out any features, but the way it moved sent a shiver down her spine. On her small island, Mia was huddled against the cold, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. The river was a black, swirling mass around her, and the sky above was an endless void of darkness. She had tried to keep her spirits up, telling herself that she would find a way off the island in the morning, but the isolation was getting to her. Every rustle in the bushes, every splash in the water, made her jump. The island was so small, there was nowhere to hide, and the thought of what might be lurking in the dark kept her on edge. As the long night dragged on, each girl faced her own battle against the wilderness, unaware of whether her friends were alive or dead. The forest, it seemed, was testing them, pushing them to their limits, stripping away their strength, their hope, and their sanity. The cold gnawed at them, the hunger clawed at their insides, and the fear was the worst of all. But they weren't ready to give up. Despite everything, they clung to the hope of survival, driven by the thought of seeing their friends again. Each girl pushed through the pain, the exhaustion and the terror, knowing that stopping would mean death. Then, on the 5th day, as the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the frozen landscape, Sarah saw something in the distance, a faint, flickering light. With the last of her strength, she made her way toward it, praying it wasn't another cruel trick of the wilderness. As she drew closer, she realized it was a fire. And sitting by that fire, shivering and haggard, were Emily, Jessica, Rachel, and Mia. The sight of her friends, battered but alive, brought tears to her eyes. They had found each other, against all odds, and the relief was overwhelming. They huddled together around the fire, sharing their stories of how they had survived the past few days. Each had faced their own horrors, Emily with the unseen stalker, Jessica with a haunted cabin, Rachel with the shadowy figure, and Mia with the crushing isolation of the island. But they were together now, and that gave them strength. But as they sat there, trying to warm themselves by the fire, a new fear began to creep in. They were still lost in the wilderness, still without food, and the wolves' howls were drawing closer. The fire, though small and flickering, was their only defense against the darkness that surrounded them. The forest, it seemed, was not ready to let them go. They had survived the storm, the separation, and the cold, but the wilderness had more trials in store. The girls could feel it, an oppressive presence that watched them from the shadows, waiting for its moment to strike. As the fire crackled in the dark, they made a silent vow they would not be taken by this place. They would survive no matter what. But deep within the forest, something ancient and malevolent stirred, watching them with cold, unblinking eyes. The wilderness had claimed many before them, and it was not accustomed to letting its prey escape. The girls were about to learn that in the depths of the Vancouver Wilderness, survival was not just a test of endurance, but a battle against forces far older and more powerful than they could ever have imagined. And as the night deepened, the wind began to whisper through the trees, carrying with it a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a voice that spoke of ancient secrets, of forgotten rituals, and of a darkness that would not be denied. The girls huddled closer to the fire, their fear growing as the whispers grew louder, the forest closing in around them. They were no longer just lost in the wilderness. They were trapped in a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead, the natural and the supernatural, had blurred, and the forest had taken on a life of its own. And as the whispers turned to screams, they realized with dawning horror that they were not alone in the dark, and that something far more terrifying than the storm had been awakened.